This morning's gospel reading, found in verses 21 through 26 of the 5th chapter of Matthew, is part of a larger group of teachings by Jesus which follow a similar formula. Each one begins with, "You have heard it said," followed by an ancient tradition or law. And then Jesus reinterprets the ancient law with words that begin with, "But I say to you." In this morning's text, Jesus says to the crowds, "You have heard it said, 'You shall not murder,' but I say to you, you shall not even get angry with your brother or sister." Then he tags onto this teaching another one that adheres to the same formula. "You have heard it said, 'You shall not commit adultery,' but I say to you, you shall not even lust." Before the reader even has a whole lot of time to give it much thought, we're given another teaching. "You have heard it said, 'You shall not swear falsely,' but I say to you, do not swear at all." Now I want to pause for a moment and point out that every single one of us here this morning can undoubtedly see ourselves in these texts. And I could spend a very long time breaking down these texts and explaining what I believe Jesus was trying to say to his listeners. But if you're really disturbed by how you may see yourself in these texts, I encourage you to make an appointment with me so we can talk one-on-one. But when I look at the texts as a whole, as I believe the author of the gospel intended for us to do, I don't think these texts are really about anger management or porn addiction or potty mouths. The points of these texts are about our relationship with others and what that has to do with righteousness and right living. Life is not about a checklist of what we can or cannot do. It's about relationship. I believe Jesus was trying to explain through a series of examples a new way of understanding, of thinking, of living, and of being in the world. It was as if people had come to believe that if they didn't kill anyone, or they didn't steal, or they didn't lie in court, they received righteousness points. But Jesus was saying that the old scorecards weren't serving their purpose anymore. And he was holding up a new set of scorecards. Scorecards based upon our relationships with other people. For example, in this morning's text, he was saying we couldn't award ourselves points for simply not killing someone. The new scorecards goes much deeper into our relationship with our neighbor. They deal with our anger, the conflict that inevitably arises between one person and another. If we feel compelled to award ourselves points, then let them be based on something more substantial than whether or not we manage to refrain from murder. Although there are some times whenever I would like to award myself points for just refraining from murder. Instead, let those points be based upon the quality of our relationship with someone. Today's churches are also in need of new scorecards. For too long, we have clung to the old traditions and ways of measuring our effectiveness in the world. After all these years, churches continue to measure our impact with the numbers of people who fill our pews and the amount of money we receive each Sunday. But we need new ways of measuring our value. We need new scorecards. Reggie McNeil is a professor, church consultant, and author of the book Missional Renaissance, Changing the Scorecard for the Church. McNeil has been advocating for some time that if churches are to have relevance in today's world, then there are some things that are going to need to change. And one of those things is what he calls scorecards. McNeil says that we need to push beyond the old scorecards of how many and how often that have so dominated the church scene in America. He goes on to say, if you only track church-centric activity and celebrate the number of people who show up for in-house events, you're just reinforcing the wrong thing. Our church culture is bent, he says. It is inward, program-driven, and institutionally focused. When asked if changing the scorecard for the church meant numbers aren't important, he replied, it is about numbers, but it's about counting different things. You have to use metrics differently to get at other kinds of important processes and dynamics. I think this is the same sort of thing that Jesus was saying in this morning's text. He wasn't saying that we no longer should refrain from committing murder. That's still important. But that can't be the way we measure our righteousness. We have to go beyond that and find a different way to get at what's important. McNeil gives some examples of what he means by new scorecards. He says we can measure the number of people we are praying for outside of our congregation. He points to a congregation that's determined to have a prayer champion for every public school teacher in their city. That's a number that you can track. He points out another church that has determined they will drive the number of hungry children in their school system to zero. Their commitment has resulted in their processing over 3 tons of food a week into over 1,000 backpacks that are going home on Friday so the kids have food to eat on the weekend. McNeil reminds us that you can measure the test scores that are going up where schools are implementing this backpack food program, or how trips to the school nurse are going down. He described 2 more churches who decided to change their scorecard from how much money they take in to how much money they give away. In this morning's reading, I believe Jesus was saying that the spiritual life needs to go beyond good behavior and mindlessly following the ancient traditions and laws. The spiritual life is about the quality of our relationship with other people. In the same way, the spiritual life of a church needs to go beyond mindlessly showing up at church and placing money in the offering basket. The spiritual life of a church is about how many lives outside of the church we are impacting, not how many people are attending on Sundays. So what might our church's scorecards look like instead of Sunday morning attendance? Our scorecards would need to include the number of people who use our building throughout this week, such as PFLAG or any of the other several support groups. It would include the number of people who use our food pantry throughout the week. And it would include the number of people who view the weekly sermon on DVD, on YouTube, or on our church's website. If we're going to start measuring the number of lives who are impacted by our church, we need scorecards that move beyond Sunday morning attendance as an indicator. And instead of simply reporting the funds that we receive each Sunday, we need to be calculating the amount of money that's given away. Money that purchases groceries for people living with HIV. Money that goes to our benevolence fund. Money that goes to our city's local crop hunger walk, or money that's raised for a local family that's in need. I believe we need to be more intentional about celebrating these kinds of numbers rather than the numbers we have become accustomed to lifting up. These new numbers are much more of a measure of relationship. They are indicators of our impact on the world. These are the sorts of new scorecards we need to be using. Jesus tried to get his audience to understand that the spiritual life is not a checklist. The spiritual life is about living in right relationship with other people. And the church needs to understand that our effectiveness as God's instruments of peace is not a simple checklist. If we aren't focusing on being in right relationship with the world, and if we aren't able to measure our impact on the people who may never enter our doors, then we need to reevaluate how we're doing things. Quite honestly, I think we're on track at this church. We have ministries to celebrate that go far beyond the numbers of people in our pews or the amount of money that's received. We need to simply find new ways of measuring the effectiveness of those ministries. We need to shift our focus away from filling the pews with people and filling the baskets with money. We need new scorecards. The more we can do this, the more vital and effective we will be in bringing God's reign on earth. Amen.